Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 15th episode of 2024. But before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor for Five for Breakfast. I just got back to Washington late last night from San Juan, Puerto Rico, where we had an amazing Fiber Broadband Association LATAM Fiber Connect workshop with a sold-out audience. We were so thrilled to have such amazing speakers from NTIA, RUS, the FCC, and the Puerto Rico broadband office, in addition to the leading operators in Puerto Rico, such as Liberty Puerto Rico and Claro Puerto Rican Telecom. It was such a great event, and it was so exciting to see the amazing infrastructure investment in Puerto Rico, especially after the horrible devastation from Hurricane Maria. Here in DC, the FCC will consider adopting open internet rules at its meeting on April 25th. So all I can say is boo hiss. It's so disappointing the FCC is trying to throw a wet blanket on this historical industry CapEx investment cycle in broadband infrastructure, but we'll see how that plays out. On the Hill this week, the focus is on privacy. The Senate Commerce Chair, Cantwell, and House Energy and Commerce Chair, McMorris Rogers, introduced a comprehensive bipartisan draft, and there's also a hearing on Thursday in the House Energy and Commerce Committee on Section 230, and whether this protection should be amended. Now that ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, the most successful broadband adoption program in history, is on the brink of ending, some states are looking at ways to create supplements to supplement the service discount for residents. It seems unlikely that state-level solutions will come to fruition by the end date for ACP, which is weeks away. Now for some exciting news, the Fiber Broadband Association is hosting our second annual Fiber Day on the Hill tomorrow on Capitol Hill. Our honorary co-chairs are Senator Welch from Vermont, Marshall from Kansas, and Representative Custer from New Hampshire, and Balderson from Ohio. This is a fantastic event. Last year we had over 250 members of Congress, staff, FCC administration, Commerce, Treasury, everybody was there, and just a great way to touch and feel and see our fiber exhibits and so forth. The Fiber Broadband Association's next regional Fiber Connect workshop will be held in Little Rock, Arkansas on Tuesday next week, April 16th. The registration for Little Rock is on pace to be our largest regional event yet, so please sign up today before it's sold out, and you're not going to want to miss that. After Little Rock, will be in Deer Valley in June, Des Moines in September, and our Canadian event is in Calgary on October 8th. We'll be in Albuquerque, New Mexico in November. And then, of course, the Granddaddy Mall, the Fiber Connect 2024 conference in Nashville is going to be the biggest in the world this year. That's July 28th to 31st. The whole industry will be there. You do not want to miss that. That brings us today's Fiber for Breakfast session with our good friend, Jaimie Lenderman, research manager and principal analyst at Omdia, who's going to be discussing an analyst perspective on North American historic broadband boom. But before I introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if everybody would please keep in mind, all participants are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located in the control panel on the side of your screen. We will host a Q&A session with Jaimie at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website for FBA members within 24 to 48 hours. You can find that recording under the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast option. At the conclusion of this presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will pass things back to Gary to get us started. Thank you very much.
Gary? Thanks, David. Good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Mark Whippage, the CEO of MPW and quantum industry expert. He discussed the potential for commercial quantum networking. Mark discussed how public and private funding will invest upwards of $6 billion per year over the next 10 years to bring quantum technologies out of the lab into commercial use. Building out our fiber broadband infrastructure is critical to our quantum future. So if you missed it, you can go to our website and watch the replay. In today's Five for Breakfast session, our good friend Jaimie Lenderman, the research manager and principal analyst for Omdia, will be discussing an analyst perspective on North America's historic broadband boom. Jaimie is a research manager and principal analyst at Omdia, overseeing the Broadband Access Intelligence Service. She provides insights to key audiences and ecosystem players. Her publications include the quarterly market share tracker, forecast, next generation technology analysis, and business strategy, and specialized consulting projects. She frequently participates in industry conferences and events around the world. Jaimie's research area include fiber, copper, cable, and fixed wireless access technology. She has worked in the telecom industry for over 7 years. Jaimie's research findings and thought leadership have been published in key findings in prominent regulatory bodies, including the FCC and the EU. She is based in southwestern Montana. So Jaimie, welcome. Always love having you. And for audience, please type in your questions as well, and we'll work those into Q&A at the end. So with that, let's get things started and kick it over to Jaimie.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning, everyone. Thank you again for having me on today. So yes, today I'd like to talk about our latest forecast. Next slide, please. So again, Jaimie Lenderman, run the Broadband Access Intelligence Service at Omdia. Thank you for that kind introduction, Gary. So with that, we'll just dive right into it. Next slide, please. So taking a look at our latest forecast, which was published in March, so just a little over a month ago, we take a look at wireline broadband access equipment. This is really a pulse on OLT and ONT/ONU ports. It allows us really a standardization to predict market activity. And so really our previous forecast was in August of 2023. And with that, we, with what happened in the second half of 2023, due to several factors, we did see a dip. And so we have readjusted our forecast. This dip, as many know, was due to some operator inventory ingestion period, which was, a sort of a leftover symptom of the pandemic. And then additionally, several macroeconomic conditions and things such as the cost of capital really pushed down what the actuals were for 2023. However, have no fear. This pushed out forecast is pushed out, but the total addressable market is still there. We do predict OLT/ONT port spend to be 110 billion through 2029 globally. There's a number of reasons for this, and for this this presentation I'll be diving down into North America, but I would like to just start at a global level just to give some context. So in China specifically, historically the largest consumer of PON equipment, is poised for massive 50G PON upgrades beginning later this year and over the next 5 years. And as well, during this forecast period, we expect India to really begin to roll out a mass market FTTH services. Additionally, due to the unprecedented opportunity, we are still forecasting a CAGR of 40% from 2023 to 2029, which is pretty significant. Of this, North America will account for 35% of spend overall during the forecast period, which equates to a little over 35 billion on OLT and ONT/ONU ports alone. And so with that, I'd like to talk regionally a little bit. Next slide, please. So taking a look at the North American forecast, I think this figure does a really good job highlighting just how massive the opportunity is in North America, and how quickly it's going to become a huge share of global fiber access equipment revenue. For example, you'll see China appears to shrink as the total percentage of global revenue for ONT/ONU PON OLT/ONU ports. However, China will remain relatively flat in annual revenue at around 4.5 billion annually. By 2029, as you can see, North America will make up over 39% of global shipment revenue. Additionally, taking a look at the EMEA region, Most of this is driven by Western Europe. However, we do expect the Middle East and Africa to really begin to pick up in their fiber to the home deployments. We expect EMEA to produce a little over 18 billion over the forecast period. Additionally, taking a look at Asia Oceania region, which does exclude China, is really poised to grow at a good clip. At around 17 billion during the forecast period. A major driver here is really the growth of fiber in India, as I mentioned. Interestingly enough, in India, it will be pretty much focused on GPON deployments due to the cost sensitivity of the market. And additionally, in Latin America, despite showing, in the later years a smaller percentage, it's still forecast to grow annually and will do a little over 10 billion during the forecast period. Next slide, please. And so taking a look here, this is really focused on North America PON port revenue. In 2023, 10 gig OLTs made up over 75% of all PON OLT port revenue in North America. And then additionally, by 2029, we expect this figure to be 99% once you include for 10G, 25G, as well as 50G PON. However, of that 99%, we expect almost 90% of that to be 10 gig revenue. With the other 11% making up 25 gig PON and 50 gig PON. We do expect OLT port revenue to reach over 12 billion during the forecast period. And additionally, switching over to ONT ONUs, we do expect in 2023, almost 60% of revenues were of all port revenue for ONT ONUs was 10 gig. This is partially due to the higher ASP of 10 gig, but it's also partially due to operators choosing to be to future-proof their home network, so to speak. It's a lot easier to pay the differential between a previous generation ONT ONU and a 10 gig CPE in order to limit truck rolls in the future. And we do expect ONT ONU revenue to reach over 25 billion by 2029 during this forecast period. Next slide, please. And so I know a lot of you are looking, how is that going to work with a limited amount of residential? There's only a limited amount of residences to pull fiber to. Well, operators are looking more and more at opportunities beyond residential. And so I wanted to just touch on a few that are the things that we're seeing the most at this time. And so really the next step for a lot of operators is to offer PON for enterprises. This is small and medium enterprises that are supporting PON infrastructure. Excuse me. And with 10G, you're really future-proofing those connections. 10G and beyond, you're really future-proofing those connections. Additionally, for smart cities, a lot of times wireless is used for these smart city applications. However, it's not always sufficient. PON can really support high bandwidth, low latency, as well as secure networking for a lot of different applications here. And additionally, we are seeing the use of PON for xHaul transport. It starts with backhaul, and as you get up in future-proof with 10 gig and beyond, you are able to move into the mid-haul. And I would say more controversially, front haul, I think that's still a good debate going on, but I do believe there are several markets where they're planning to use 50 gig PON for that. And additionally, Wi-Fi data aggregation, we are seeing PON support this. 10 gig PON provides sufficient bandwidth as well and is a future-proof opportunity. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to deliver some key messages. I've been having a lot of conversations around BEAD, around the private investment opportunity in the US, and some of the things that I really just want to get across. For example, one, I think the elephant in the room of 2023, really, we saw shipments down. We saw some network investments slow. However, this is in the short term. The appetite for fiber access equipment is still there. We expect it to pick up in year end as we start to see some of these funds released, as operators gain access to funding, and as well as new operators enter the market, and we really see competition continue to grow. Additionally, I've been having a lot of conversations with various ecosystem players, and I can't emphasize how important it is to establish these partnerships now. This includes across the board active and passive vendors, network infrastructure planning, construction, and deployment. And a lot of points with that one in particular, get them involved early in the process. It's a bulk of the CapEx that you're spending, and it's right to get it right the first time. It's a lot less expensive to get it right the first time, I guess I will say. And then, relationships with integrators, test and measurement, and as Gary, I think, would emphasize, permitting and regulatory agencies, how important those relationships are as well. And I think the last thing to think about is we're seeing this, epic investment on building out these networks, but really operators need to think long term. What do you want your network to be able to deliver, initially? 1 year from now, 5, 10 years? Do you want to move into non-residential services? Do you want to do non-residential only? How I think one big thing on everyone's mind is workforce management and retention. How do we get these, professionals into this industry and keep them there? So is the network simple, to work on? What can really, the main question is, what can be implemented today while you're rolling out the network to prepare for tomorrow's challenges as well as opportunities? And so I know I sort of went, through that pretty quickly, but I really wanted to leave some time for questions. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present and be here today, Gary. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
But Jaimie, is always great stuff. Hey, David, roll to her first slide. I think it was slide 7. There we go. So I think this is super interesting because this is kind of the gut punch to the supply side of the industry. Last year we had record deployment, 9.2 or 9 million homes passed, right? We went from 8.2 to 9 million homes passed, and yet the supply side just, they didn't have any sales last year. The factory was quiet, and so this is definitely what we're seeing, is that deployment has continued to go up, but the actual sales from the suppliers was down last year. And so this looks like that a slight recovery in 24, and then we start really getting on a good trajectory. So your previous forecast is almost a demand forecast, and so with the inventory, that kind of put us in this lull. So I think that tracks exactly what we've been seeing. That's really good stuff.
Yeah, and I think if you were to pull back, the historical results to a couple years, you'd see a big spike. And so, of course, that's, the demand happening, that demand during and the supply chain issues that were lingering from the pandemic. But yes, I absolutely agree with you. The deployments were still absolutely happening. It's just that ingestion period of getting through that inventory is what really was the story in 2023. And as you can see, it's going to take a little bit to get back on that linear track, but we do expect in the long term it's going to be an even better story.
Yeah, our research was showing that the passives worked their way down to the inventory surplus at first, and then it was the actives, or the PON equipment, and then the last thing would be fiber itself. But we should be all recovering this year, and we should start seeing the factories crank up again. I'll go to the next slide, David. I think this next slide is really informative, because when I think about, you know, the rule of thumb had always been, you know, look for China. You know, China was the volumes, and you know, Paul always asks such great questions, and he's like, what about NG-PON2? Is there life beyond Verizon? And that was always the problem, is that you could never get any volume on NG-PON2 because it was just Verizon and not in China. But here, and you're showing that the tipping point is in 2026, where North America is where all the volume is, and that continues to grow throughout the end of the decade. So can you comment on NG-PON2 and kind of where you see, you know, this whole shift to North America driving the industry?
Yeah, sure. So NG-PON2 will continue to make up a very small portion of global deployments. Yes, Verizon is still committed to deploying. However, the ASPs, the average pricing for NG-PON2 is just really high for most operators. And so while it is a very compelling technology and it's doing a lot for the operators that have deployed it, we do expect 10G-PON, just from a strictly a cost point of view, to remain the dominant technology in North America. Really, where you see this huge jump in 2026, we really expect, as I mentioned, the funding to start to shake out in late 2024, but it's going to take some time for those shipments to really roll out, and then subsequently the deployments of the shipments. And so we really see the shipments happening in a really big way in 2026. And I think that's, you know, why I emphasize to build those partnerships now, because you need to get in line essentially to make those orders. And it's much better to do that earlier, you know, rather than later. You know, at this time, with what I've heard from vendors, I don't foresee a shipment crunch. They're already ramping up. They've, you know, a lot of them, as you know, have met BABA requirements proactively. I don't expect to see a shipment crunch, but there's definitely going to be a huge influx of orders at once, especially as I'm hearing some states will release all the funding at once. Obviously, you can talk to that better than I can, Gary. But, you know, with the deadline to get these networks rolled out and operated, in operating status, there's going to be a big line. So yes, just to emphasize those partnerships.
You know, also, I think this is interesting, and then when you get out to later years, you know, if China's flat at 4.5 billion, it really puts a lot of pressure on like Huawei and ZTE, because, you know, as being persona non grata in the US, they're limited. And so the price dumping they've been doing in India and in Europe is going to continue. When I looked at, you know, The Economist is basically saying Europe's in a lot of trouble because you have the Ukrainian war, then you have the Chinese price dumping, and then if there's an administration change in the US, then there'll be more protectionism. And so it's just like the triple whammy against Europe. But do you see a huge crunch, you know, as far as price dumping by the Chinese, and, you know, nowhere to get their volume?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to see what's going on in China. The FTTR, the fiber to the room story, is huge for their continued growth models. We are seeing significant rollouts in China. At one point, last year, I heard 20,000 deployments a week from a regional operator in China, as well as their movement towards 50 gig PON. Obviously, there's some government subsidization to support those 50 gig PON rollouts from the major operators, China Telecom, China Mobile, and China Unicom. But yes, I do. Right now, we do see there is an opportunity, especially in the rest of Asia region. We are seeing some major partnerships with the Chinese vendors to roll out PON in a big way. And then, as well as you know, Eastern Europe, we have growing slightly, but again, there's not, as we know, it's that the extreme, you know, macro conditions with the war, really, you know, there's not a lot of growth going on. But your Eastern Europe's also had fiber for a very long time. granted at, previous generations. So I do
Okay,
think, yeah.
I got a million questions here, lots of
Okay,
activity. So let's kind of hit short answers and
sounds
go to
good.
the next slide, David, because this one is what's the mix of revenue between ONTs and OLTs, and does that include gateways in the home? And I think you sort of addressed that in this slide, right?
Yeah, so this is strictly ports. This is for OLTs, these are the ports and the line cards, and then for the ONT ONUs, this is strictly the ports that support that. So ONT ONU is at the customer premise. OLT is on the central office, or central office remotely at the edge. In the aggregation point. That's really the beauty of what's going on right now with the OLTs, is there's lots of new vendor solutions supporting that.
All right, so this is an interesting question. This kind of goes into one of your conclusions. What's the projection for non-residential services? Is it just an aspiration or a platitude?
We're already seeing a significant number of operators globally using non-residential for using PON for non-residential services. I don't have an exact split on me right this moment, but it is happening in a big way, and I think it's definitely going to start to grow in the US as operators look to have new revenue streams.
All right, 25 gig versus 50 gig. How much does standardization difference matter?
I will be honest with you, I've had this question for years now, and there is a market for 25 gig. There are deployments of 25 gig. So I think it shows, overall that PON is a really opportune technology, and it really doesn't matter, based on what the speed is. It matters that there's a huge desire, to deploy PON. So I really don't think standardization matters at this point.
So Lou has a great question. When I looked at a lot of the analyst earnings reports that came out this week, ACP definitely had a big impact on a lot of providers, especially in the cable industry. How great is the concern that ACP uncertainty will delay investment?
Well, I think for that, I can just talk to some operators that I've seen are already, they're choosing to sort of honor that discount every month. While I don't think the story is over with ACP or a related situation, it may potentially slow some things down in the short term, but it is an important thing to help develop rural America and to make it a sustainable venture for everyone to have connectivity. But I don't think the story's over with that. I think there's still a lot of work that can be done on that side.
All right, hopefully you can get a short answer to this one because it's a long question.
Okay.
So how critical do you think the initial planning and financial modeling from the start, as well as keep validating the originals and assumptions and planning due to the changes in competitive intensity and cost to deploy? So a lot of moving parts,
Okay, let's break that down real quick. Could you, sorry, can you
So how
repeat one more
critical
time?
is the initial planning and financial modeling from the start, as well as to keep validating the original assumptions due to all the changes in the competitive intensity and cost to deploy?
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, I think a really good point to look at is what's happening with RDOF right now. These assumptions were made back in 2020, and now we're seeing a number of operators not be able to fulfill it. So I think it's to keep going back and making sure that your assumptions are right, and to be working with those integrators and those contractor partners that really know what they're doing and can help do it right and under the right cost the first time.
Well, Jaimie, I could go all day. You're so informative and have so much great research. I really appreciate that. And I also just want to make a comment about your colleague, Julie Kunstler. We're so sad that she is, well, happy for her, she's retiring, but sad for the industry that she's leaving us to pursue her life's bucket list. So anyway, just give our best to Julie.
Will do. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, well, thanks for joining us today, and I look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We're going to have Todd Butcher, the Vice President of Power Distribution at S&N Communications, to honor National Lineman's Appreciation Day. And our session will be on fiber and electrical, a marriage made in safety. So this is really going to be focused on linemen and all the great work they're doing. So everyone, hope to see you guys at Fiber Day in the Hill tomorrow, and in Little Rock on Tuesday, and then Fiber for Breakfast on Wednesday. Thanks, everyone. See you guys.